In 1854, Sir Edward Belcher ordered 4 Royal Navy ships abandoned in the Arctic. His men survived. His career did not. And one of the ships he left behind later drifted far enough to turn a naval embarrassment into one of the best-known pieces of furniture in American political history, the Resolute Desk. That is the scandal. But the court-martial did not begin with a shipwreck. It began with paper, orders, dates, signals, written instructions from the Admiralty, written orders from one captain to another. The whole case against Belcher, commander of the last great Royal Navy search for Franklin, had to pass through documents before it could reach the ice. That is why the popular version is too small. It asks whether Belcher was afraid. The transcript asks a colder question. What was a commander allowed to do when 5 ships, 3 search objectives, and several hundred miles of Arctic ice stopped obeying one line of command? In 1852, Britain sent Belcher north with a squadron, not a single ship. Hold the map in 3 parts. Belcher, in assistance and pioneer, goes north through Wellington Channel. Kellett, in Resolute and Intrepid, goes west toward Melville Island. North Star stays at Beechey Island as the depot ship. 1 expedition, 3 zones, 1 commander who could not see all of it. The mission was built from a national absence. Sir John Franklin had sailed in 1845 with Erebus and Terror. By 1852, no one in Britain could prove where his crews had gone. Beechey Island had given Britain proof that Franklin had wintered there. It had not given Britain a route after that. Every new search carried 2 burdens at once: finding men in ice and proving the Admiralty had not stopped too soon. By 1852, the search was no longer only a rescue mission. Ships had gone north, men had died, money had been spent, families still waited. The Admiralty needed an answer, and it needed a way to end the question without admitting that the end had come from exhaustion rather than discovery. Belcher's expedition had 2 practical tasks: search for Franklin through Wellington Channel and the high Arctic lanes where some officers still thought he might have gone. At the same time, look for Robert McClure and Richard Collinson, whose own ships had entered from Bering Strait and had not safely returned. The plan looked rational on an Admiralty table. It did not remain rational once the squadron split. Assistance and Pioneer were Belcher's Northern Division. Resolute and Intrepid were Kellett's Western Division. North Star was the hinge of the whole operation: depot, rendezvous, message board, and if everything failed, the way home. The fatal assumption was that a 5-ship search expedition could still be commanded like a smaller voyage. 1 commander, 1 Admiralty intention, 1 expectation that written orders could hold the operation together across distance, ice, and different local facts. But the squadron was not one body after it divided. Belcher and Kellett were not looking at the same ice. They were not reading the same sky. They were not carrying the same immediate risk. Discipline could carry an order across the Arctic. It could not carry the local judgment that made the order good. This is the part a ship-centered telling misses. A ship can have 1 captain because every man aboard shares the same weather, the same hull, the same immediate danger. A squadron spread across the Parry Islands does not share those things. It shares paperwork. It shares rank. It shares the hope of a rendezvous at Beechey Island. That is not the same as shared judgment. That is the case inside the case. For the first season, the search did not look like a failure. Sledge parties moved out from the ships. Belcher's Northern Division explored channels and coasts. Kellett's Western Division reached the ground from which McClure could be rescued. In April 1853, a party from Resolute found McClure's investigator at Mercy Bay. McClure and his men had been trapped for 2 winters. They had not found Franklin, but they had helped prove the existence of a Northwest Passage by a route no single ship had completed. That success matters because it complicates the indictment. Belcher's squadron did not simply go north and do nothing. It searched, it moved. It rescued men who might otherwise have remained locked in Mercy Bay. The court file is not a clean story of incompetence from the first day. It is worse than that. The expedition worked just enough to make its command problem harder to see. By the winter of 1853 to 1854, the search had become a problem of return. Resolute and Intrepid were icebound in the west. Assistance and Pioneer were held in the Wellington Channel region. North Star waited at Beechey Island. The Admiralty, watching from London, had begun to put limits around a search that had lasted nearly 9 years since Franklin sailed. At this point, the question changes. It is no longer only, could they find Franklin? It is, who had the right to decide when the search was over? Hansard records the parliamentary pressure plainly. On the 4th of April 1854, Sir James Graham told the House of Commons that Belcher had orders to leave the ice, except if some circumstance left a lingering hope that one more winter might succeed. In that case, he had additional power to remain. That sentence is the hinge. Belcher was not ordered to die in the ice for Franklin. He was not ordered to bring every ship home at any cost. He was given discretion. Discretion sounds broad in London. In the Arctic, it becomes a blade. If Belcher stayed and men died, the record could ask why he had risked life after the search had failed. If he left and the ships escaped later, the same record could ask why he had abandoned valuable vessels that might have sailed home. In April 1854, Kellett received the order that changed the Western Division. He was to abandon Resolute and Intrepid and bring the men east to Beechey Island. Kellett did not read his local situation the same way Belcher did. Later accounts preserve his resistance. The ships were held, but they were not wrecked. Stores existed. The crews were not collapsing. The ice might release them. Kellett understood the naval consequence of leaving a sound ship. He wanted explicit written orders. The request also reveals the emotional discipline of naval bureaucracy. Kellett did not have to call Belcher a coward. He did not have to predict that Resolute would one day be found. He only had to insist that the order be written. In a court-martial system, paper was not clerical. Paper was survival. That request was not small. It meant Kellett was placing the responsibility where the chain of command said it belonged. If Resolute and Intrepid were to be left, the abandonment would not be remembered as Kellett's judgment. It would be Belcher's order. On 15th of May 1854, Resolute and Intrepid were left in the ice. Hatches were secured. Notices were left for traveling parties. Men moved by sledge toward Beechey Island. They obeyed. Obedience is not agreement. The West had now become evidence against the whole command structure. A subordinate commander had protested. A superior commander had overruled him. The ships were still standing when the men walked away. Belcher's own division took longer to reach the same point. Assistants and pioneers spent their second winter in the high Arctic. In August 1854, they began to move down the channel. Later summaries record that assistants and pioneer were released from winter quarters on 6th of August, and that by 22nd of August, there was open water in Barrow Strait with a remaining belt of ice between the ships and the route out. That does not prove they could certainly have escaped. It does prove why the abandonment became so difficult to defend. The last confirmed point of this case is not a death or a disappearance. It is the order to abandon and the morning that followed it. Belcher's later narrative describes 25 August 1854 with the precision of a man who knew every detail would be weighed. The decks had been swept, the cabins put in order, the colors, pendant, and jacks secured as if nailed to the mast. The men assembled in traveling order on the ice. Then they crossed the side. No cheering, no speech that solved the matter, just the ships behind them and Beechey Island ahead. This is where legend takes over if the record is not watched closely. The legend says Belcher abandoned 4 good ships because he lacked nerve. The records say something less useful and more severe. Belcher had Admiralty discretion. Kellett disputed the necessity. The ships were not destroyed when left. The men did return alive. The court later acquitted Belcher, but did not praise his judgment. That is not an exoneration in the moral sense. It is a legal outcome inside a narrow question. The squadron gathered at Beechey Island. North Star, Phoenix, and Talbot carried the men home. The return did not bring Franklin home. It brought back McClure and the investigator survivors, and it brought back the news that the last major official search had left ships behind. There is a grim arithmetic here. A rescue mission had rescued McClure. It had not rescued Franklin. It had saved living crews by leaving ships. It had preserved men and surrendered property. Every side could select a fact and make it sound final. The Times coverage in October 1854 caught the public shape of the return. The expedition had set out with ships, money, and national expectation. It came back with no Franklin, 1 rescued Western crew, and a court-martial waiting. The court-martial was not optional theater. A naval officer who lost or abandoned a ship had to answer for it. McClure, Kellett, Richards, and Belcher all passed through the machinery of naval law. The subordinate officers could point to orders. Belcher could point to discretion. Then came the finding. It held that, given the confidence placed in Belcher by the Admiralty and the broad discretionary powers given to him, he had not acted beyond his orders when abandoning Assistance and Pioneer or directing the abandonment of Resolute and Intrepid. It added that, if circumstances had permitted, consultation with Kellett would have been advisable. Read that as a legal instrument, not as a scene of moral clarity. The finding protects the authority of the Admiralty as much as it judges Belcher. If the Admiralty had given him discretion, the court could hardly punish him for using it unless it could prove that his use of it broke the limits of the order. The court did not prove that. It also did not say his judgment was good. That last phrase matters. It is the court saying the chain of command was legally intact, while the method of command was not beyond criticism. Then came the swords. In the Royal Navy, a return sword could mean more than the wording of the verdict. Kellett received his with approval. Belcher received his without warmth. The court had acquitted him. The service had not embraced him. What we know is this. Belcher commanded a 5-ship Franklin search expedition in 1852. The squadron divided. Kellett's Western Division rescued McClure's investigator crew. In 1854, Belcher ordered the abandonment of Resolute, Intrepid, Assistance, and Pioneer. North Star returned. The men came home. Belcher was court-martialed and acquitted. He did not receive another active command. What we do not know is simpler and harder. We do not know whether Assistance and Pioneer would have escaped if Belcher had waited. We do not know whether Resolute and Intrepid would have sailed home under Kellett if the order had not come. We do know Resolute later drifted free, but a later drift is not the same as a commander's certainty in May. That is the trap in this episode. Resolute makes Belcher look wrong after the fact. In September 1855, the American whaler George Henry, commanded by James Buddington, found HMS Resolute in the ice of Baffin Bay. The ship was empty, wet, damaged by cold, but still alive as a vessel. Buddington and his men worked her free, brought her to New London, and the United States later repaired and returned her to Britain as a diplomatic gift. The recovery became a perfect symbol because it was so simple on the surface. The ship Belcher had ordered abandoned came back. That sentence is true. It is also not enough. Resolute's survival proves Kellett's hope was not foolish. It proves the ship was not a wreck when abandoned. It does not prove every ship would have escaped. It does not prove Belcher knew the exact future and refused it. It does not prove cowardice. But it does prove that the court-martial did not answer the question that history wanted answered. The court asked whether Belcher had exceeded his orders. The historical question is different. Could his command system process disagreement from the officers closest to the ice? Belcher's defenders can point to the Admiralty's April instructions, to the exhaustion of the Franklin search, to the real danger of another winter, and to the fact that the crews returned alive. Belcher's critics can point to Kellett's protest, to the condition of Resolute, to the later recovery, to Assistance and Pioneer's August movement, and to the court's cold language about consultation. The clinical reading is not a compromise between the two. It is a refusal to make the record simpler than it is. The decision that changed everything was not only the physical abandonment on the ice, it was the earlier decision to centralize judgment in a commander who could not see all parts of his own expedition at once. Kellett knew his 2 ships. Belcher knew his orders. The Admiralty knew the political limit of the search. No one position contained the whole case. By this point, the abandoned ships are no longer the whole story. The real story is a system trying to turn a distributed Arctic problem into a single yes or no question. Authorized or unauthorized, guilty or acquitted, ship lost or ship saved. The ice had made the real question messier. Which officer's local knowledge should have controlled the moment when the order was given? That is what span of control means in a 19th century Arctic squadron. Distance does not merely slow communication. It changes command. It turns every order into a guess about conditions the commander cannot personally inspect. It makes consultation not courtesy, but evidence. Belcher treated discretion as authority. The court accepted that legally. The Arctic did not accept it operationally. There is one more layer to the legend. The oak of Resolute eventually became furniture. Queen Victoria had a desk made from the ship's timbers and gave it to the President of the United States. The desk is now the part of the story more people recognize than the court-martial that made the ship famous. That afterlife is strange because it softens the case. A derelict ship becomes a diplomatic object. A contested order becomes a symbol of friendship. The awkward question disappears into polished wood. But before the desk, there was a hearing room. Before the hearing room, there was a written order. Before the written order, there was an assumption about command. The verdict is this: Belcher's abandonment order was not proven cowardice, and the court's acquittal was not proof of sound judgment. It was the product of a rescue mission whose command structure had grown larger than the discipline used to control it. The name Belcher survived as a verdict people could pronounce quickly. The inquiry transcript is less convenient. It leaves us with a commander legally inside his orders, officers materially unconvinced by them, and a recovered ship that turned the silence of the court into a question no acquittal could close.